Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to another great episode of Royal Black and Elite, where we talk about contemporary issues affecting the Black community from yesterday, today, and in the future. I'm Lady Trinette Wilson. I am a social historian, and I'm your lecturer today. And I am gearing up for my Royal Black and Elite tour, where I tour HBCUs or anybody who will invite me to talk about the royal side of Black history. And speaking of that, y'all, thank you. We have reached almost 2,000. We are, I think, at 2,000. And I can't thank you enough for liking and sharing and subscribing. And today's lecture is going to be very interesting because in my studies, I found out that there is only one company owned by an African American man or woman in the United States that manufactured cars. And it was called the C.R. Patterson and Sons Companies. Now, I'm a car girl. I love Porsches. I love Bentleys. But my favorite car is the Lexus because it is affordable and reliable. But it's just astounding to find out that this company closed in 1938, and there hasn't been another Black company in the United States since. Now, there are some companies on the continent of Africa, but today we're going to focus on Charles Patterson. He is actually the founder of the C.R. Patterson Company. And it's just an interesting story. Thank you for joining me. Let's jump right in to today's lecturer. Now, his name was Charles Richard Patterson, and he was born in 1833. We don't know the exact year. You know how that is. The records during that time was very shaky. But they believed he was born in 1833, and he was born in the state of Virginia. His mom and dad's name was Charles and Nancy Patterson, and he had four siblings. Now, they were born on a plantation and they were enslaved. But in 1841 or about 1842, the family moved to Ohio. Now, there is no record if they were freed or if they escaped, but nevertheless, they ended up in Ohio. Now, as a young kid, he began to work learning how to be a blacksmith. And by the time he became an adult, he moved up to a foreman at the Dines and Simpson Carriage and Coach Makers Company. Now, coaches and carriages were the ride of that day. And it was during the Gilded Age. So he was during the time when people like James Fortin, he was in Philadelphia. He was a sail maker. He was a millionaire. Or James Wormley, he was the first Black man who had a hotel. Check him out. And I just did Downing. And in fact, Downing was known as the Oyster King. So check him out. He was in New York. Or even Mary Ellen Pleasant, who was a wealthy woman in San Francisco. So during this time, there were Black wealth all over the country, but some concentrated in the north. And carriages were one way that Black people gained wealth. They would fix them, they would make them, and they would sell them. So he was like one of the first car dealer, if you will, but he was a carriage dealer back in the 1800s. So it's really exciting to know that Black people had that type of innovation. And of course, they were really the seamstresses, the cooks, the maids, the car makers, the blacksmiths. So the skills were off the chain back in those days. And I really feel like we are missing so much of that. We don't make anything today, they would rather ride in the car than make the car. So, but back in 1800s, this is the mindset of the Black people. So C.R. Patterson, after he had worked for the Dines and Simpson Carriage and Coach Company, he was the foreman there. He learned how to be a blacksmith, and then he wanted to start his own company. So he partnered in 1873 with a man named J.P. Lowe. Now, J.P. was a manufacturer of these carriages, and he was a white man, and so he could write his name on a lot of the paperwork. And unfortunately, that's kind of the way it was back then. But by 1888, the company employed 10 people, and that is really a big deal for a partially Black owned company in 1888. In 1893, there was like this financial scare, and things started kind of getting a little shaky. So JP was like, you know what? I'm out. I don't want to be in this business anymore. But Charles, or C.R. Patterson, had positioned himself financially to be able to buy out JP's portion of the company. So it was renamed the C.R. Patterson Son and Company to include his son Samuel. Now it is believed that Samuel grew ill in 1897 and he passed away in 1899. And so in stepped his eldest son, Frederick Douglass Patterson. And this is really where the company really took off after his fall, after Frederick came on board. Now by 1900, the company was producing like 28 different horse-drawn carriages and buggies and backboards and phaetons and surreys, and they was really selling something really popular called the doctor's buggy. So they were really doing well, and they had 50 employees, a black owned company. Can you imagine? Back in 1900, here's one of their carriages. It kind of made me like, what? It's called the Patterson Whipper. And going through what we went through in those days, it's weird that they would name it the Whipper. But anyway, here you go. They were known for their advertising, so they would get the word out about these carriages. But it was the 1900s, and the car had been invented in 1888. So they had to come with the times. Horses weren't around anymore, so when in 1910 Charles passed, Frederick shifted gears and shifted the focus of the company. At first, he began by repairing existing automobiles. But on September the 23rd, 1915, the first C.R. Patterson Sons and automobile was assembled. It was a two-door coupe. Now it is believed that it was sold for 685 dollars, and some reports say it was about $850. So that would be about around $20,000-$30,000 today. Can you believe it? He created a car. Now, it's believed that he can create about 30 to 150 cars, but none of those cars remain today. There are no pictures of those, which I just can't even believe, but anyway, they're not. I'm going to show you some pictures of what those cars looked like at that time. We talked about the two-door coupe that he, debuted, but it took him about 2 weeks to make a car. And one of the reasons that it was difficult to compete with Ford was because they could make like 1,000 cars in 2 minutes. So they had a bigger distribution, bigger assembly. And so unfortunately, Charles could not keep up with production. He couldn't really compete. And it was costing him a fortune to make the cars because, of course, it was known as a handmade car and very, very expensive to make. They were headquartered in Ohio, and Fred was a really smart guy. And he said, you know what? We're going to have to pivot. We're going to have to pivot into a new type of business in order for us to stay relevant and open. And so, what they did is around the 1920s and 30s, he started focusing on designing trucks and bus bodies. And so he got contracts with the school districts to outfit their buses. So he didn't have to manufacture them, but he made them nicer and more beautiful. And so that's what he did for like 10 years, and it was working. He renamed the company to the Greenfield Bus Body Company. Richard Patterson, that's Frederick's great great grandson, he said at the peak of the company, they had 80 employees and they manufactured 500 buses a month and produced about 7,000 altogether between 1920 and 1931. So, up until the 1950s, the buses that they were producing were still on the road. But pesky rules like rules and regulations on how to build buses and how to keep them safe came into play. Frederick kept the company going as long as he could, and I bet he made his father so proud. When the business started kind of going down because of these rules and regulations, business started falling off, and Frederick actually passed in 1932. And once he passed away, his son took it over, but the company was closed completely by 1938. In 2021, Frederick was inducted into the Automobile Automotive Hall of Fame in Dearborn, Michigan. So we're proud that people are starting to know that there was a Black owned automobile company. During our lectures, we were talking about the Black elite, and Frederick would really be considered one of those. And however, one of the problems that happened back then was that Frederick, he actually sued a school for his son to attend an all-white school. So there were some blacks who did not support them, which hence I think probably led to some of the selling to businesses versus individual people. But no matter who they were selling to, in the end, in 1938, the company closed its doors. It's just so amazing that we haven't had another company owned by an African American who manufactures cars in the United States. Again, on the continent, there are some, but not here. I hope you enjoyed today's story, learning all about the C.R. Patterson and Sons Company. To know that we were manufacturing cars back in the 1800s makes me proud. I hope you learned a lot. Let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for liking, sharing, and subscribing, and I'll see you on another great episode of Royal Black and Elite.